Now to make mine, I chose 12mm hardwood plywood, but if I'd do this again, I'd go for a soft plywood because it's prettier. However, I went for strength. And the only bit you'll see is underneath and the cut sides. And I drew around what I've been using for years, which is an IKEA laptop support. Although you can go for whatever shape you like depending on your laptop. And I got 3 cuts out of this. Then I took it outside and cut my first one with a jigsaw. And I did this as carefully as possible because this I'd be treating as a template. I like this. And because I'll be using a flush trim router bit, I cut around the remaining 2 as close as possible, but I'll be tidying those up later. And maybe I could have used the IKEA one straight away as a template, but because I'd never used it before, I was worried about damaging it. But I'll definitely try something like that next time. The only thing with my method is it's not going to be absolutely CNC perfect, but it was good enough for me. So to get my main template ready, I sanded around all of my cut edges until I was happy enough. And while I had it in my hand, I might as well just sand the sides as well. Now I've seen quite a few people use double-sided sticky tape to tape their template and the other cuts together, but I never had any, so I'm just temporarily using some blue tack. It's like really hard chewing gum, just to give it some resistance while I clamped it together, because I knew I'd have to move the clamps as I went. So because the bearing is at the bottom, that will be following the template, so the template is at the bottom. And I'm removing excess off the top one to match the bottom. And I had to do a lot of unclamping and moving. And did that with my final one. That's better. And then I went over the edges with some wood filler where I'd see the odd hole or gap in the plywood. So once I'd left the filler to dry and sanded it all down, I treated with some Danish oil. These will be the sides that will have the cushion on them. I also treated the edges as well because I like the extra detail it gives. So I'd left it to dry, and the next day it was time to cut out my wallpaper. A few tips: I would go for a darker one if you can, just so little dust particles aren't visible, and preferably one without a straight pattern. That way you can skip trying to be really precise like I am now. Although I did find that the centre leaf wasn't exactly central of the paper, but the beauty is you can use any pattern you like, but providing it's flat and smooth, or a pretty patterned cotton fabric. So after making some registration marks, I brushed over a thin coat of hard coat Mod Podge. I'll leave a link to everything I'm using below, and brushed it over the side that had no Danish oil on at all. Dog hair. And placed it on the back of the wallpaper. You've probably only got about 10 seconds to work with this. And I got rid of any air and bubbles by going over it with a hard rubber roller. I believe this is called a brayer. And because the edges were bunching up while they were pressing on my worktop, I trimmed off as much excess as I could now with sharp scissors, and then continued as much as I could with the brayer. And I left that for about 2 hours and came back and removed all of the excess very carefully with a sharp scalpel. And to remove any excess left behind, I went over it with very fine sandpaper, going at a downwards angle but never sanding up. And now to give it a really tough finish. So I poured my Mod Podge in a lined paint tray. I only used a little bit at a time because it does dry within about 20 to 30 minutes. And I gave each one about 5 thin coats with a mini foam roller. But I also went over the edges at the same time as well. But I wouldn't worry too much about when it looks a little bit white, because it should dry clear, providing you haven't gone too thick. And after each coat, I gently went over it with some really fine plumber's wire wool that I had. This was to knock any lumps and bumps off and allow it to adhere better for the second coat. But I was really impressed with how this turned out, and it feels really sturdy and scratch resistant. So the next day I wanted to add my cushions to the back of the trays. Now something I would totally not recommend is using a really heavy duty sticky Velcro. I hope this goes very well and doesn't frustrate me. Going to be quite a tight spot here. And that's because it kept jamming my sewing machine. I knew that was going to get in a pickle. So an hour's job turned into 3, just to make sure they wouldn't come off with the cushion itself. But instead of sticking the matching strips on the back of the cushions, I would just pin these instead and then take it to the sewing machine. And these cushions were the perfect size for these trays, but you could also use a sofa cushion you find, or even a pillowcase. So now I have a really cool laptop tray, and hopefully my family will like them as well.